Okay, our next guest, presenter, Mark Cummings, is a fascinating individual. I've been involved in various ways in the new energy issues, and what always kept coming up when you hear someone's name again and again and again, oh, you must know Mark Cummings, or have you ever met Mark Cummings, and Mark Cummings, and Mark Cummings, and I thought, I got to meet this guy. And then when I finally did, which was, I think it was near the end of last summer, it clicked, this is why everyone talks about Mark Cummings. Mark has the unique capability to blend the high science of new energy with a deep insight in what's really required in the mainstream citizenry to get this and open up the gates to make it happen. And a lot of that requires the facilitating its entry into the marketplace. So he's done a lot of research on that, both technically and what are the mechanisms required and what needs to happen in the mind of people to accept and embrace this. Pleased to introduce Mark Cummings.
Hello? Okay. It's a real delight to be here and be able to address you. This conference has been dealing with an issue that's been very close to my heart and been a central focus of my passions for more than 2 decades. And that really comes out of a deep love of the earth and a love of humanity and just a clear sense that the way that we're proceeding forward in terms of our relationship to the earth is unsustainable. And I realized that when I was a little kid. I actually thought, in the 70s, that surely by the end of the 70s we'll see the phasing out of internal combustion engines. And I continue to be a little bit, perhaps overly optimistic about how well and how quickly the human race can get the message and make the appropriate adjustments to what is becoming increasingly obviously an unsustainable infrastructure that is doing damage to all life. The biospheric crisis is something that is really becoming mainstream. It's something that all of us know about. The evidence has become overwhelming. I remember just a few years ago when the scientists were really in a debate about global warming. Well, the debate has pretty much been silenced, and many of the climatologists and atmospheric scientists, meteorologists, oceanographers who were gathering an enormous amount of data have been really shocked by the severity of the damage to the biosphere that we have already wreaked upon our planet, and such that the crisis, really, if you go to any climate change conferences, it's kind of mind-blowing what they're saying and how little of the accurate message of what is known at the leading edge of science actually gets out to the human race. How much the media is basically preventing humanity from having the right, accurate information, which is necessary for us, an appropriate response to the situation. So, given the biospheric crisis, that provides a profound challenge to all of us. I think it actually also can create the common ground whereby we can go forward, because the biospheric crisis brings all of humanity into a common realization that we are all together in this lifeboat, this planet Earth, which is our life support system. The biosphere, the Gaian being that is the planet, is being realized more and more to not just be a whole bunch of organisms, but the biosphere is actually a single life form. There's really only one life form on the planet. It is the biosphere, and we are the biosphere. We often tend to talk about the biosphere as like something else, like we're not part of it. We as organic beings are the biosphere, and human beings right now are the only species that is engaged in a dynamic that is killing the biosphere, that is really undermining the life support system of the planet. And so it is our responsibility, and it is in our hands to turn that around, to actually develop a new sustainable infrastructure. Right now, the infrastructure relative to energy makes it very difficult for people to do the right thing relative to the environment. It costs so much more to actually have clean energy systems. To have an emissionless electric car is outside of most people's budget. I believe that the average person, if given an option between doing something that is polluting and desecrating to the biosphere versus something that is not, if it didn't cost any more, everybody, I believe, the vast majority of people would choose that which is earth-friendly, but we don't have that option. Things have been engineered by corporate forces and forces that are benefiting off of the fossil fuel technologies and many of just the whole kind of corporate hegemony, which is metastasized all over the planet and is really the greatest challenge and threat to life on Earth right now. It's exactly like cancer tumors. You know, what a cancer tumor does in the body of an organism is it looks out for its own best interest. It just wants to grow and expand without any thought of that it may be killing the organism upon which it ultimately depends. Corporations that look out just for their bottom line are identical to that in the body of the Earth and in the body of humanity. So we have this enormous crisis on our hands, but we also have a fantastic array of solutions that are emerging from the brilliance of the human mind and the human heart engaging a much deeper understanding and exploration of the nature of fundamental physics. At the foundations of physics right now, there is an enormous revolution taking place. Much of it's not being televised because it's so revolutionary. Literally, our understandings of fundamentals, understanding of space, time, light, mass, force, all of those things that most lay people think most physicists agree upon are hotly under debate, and we're coming to understand that our previous concepts of those were very much informed by the materialistic scientific model that left consciousness out of the picture and tended to try to see the world as an objective material object independent from the mind of the observer. What we're now coming to see is just for example, this really contextualizes much of the discussions that we've had relative to the physics of these devices. We now know that space, just this seeming emptiness that is all-pervading, which is called by the scientific community the quantum vacuum, is anything but a vacuum. Everything we know about space now is that it is seething with energetic potentiality. It has an enormous energy density. There's various debates about what exactly that is, but it's so enormous that it really stretches our imagination to imagine how could that much energy be embedded in the very fabric of this seemingly empty space all around us. We've come to understand that space is not so much just a dead empty void, but is in actuality a structure structured out of pure potential. And this potential has an infinite quality. It's radially, omnidirectionally balancing itself out and canceling itself out in all directions so as to appear as emptiness. But in fact, when you perturb it in certain ways, we find out that it's seething with energy. And in fact, that underlying infinite potential is really that which really contextualizes and embraces all of existence. It's at the foundations of quantum physics and quantum field theory. None of the equations would work out right if it wasn't for this underlying zero-point field, which fills all space. This enormous amount of energy, as John Wheeler calculated the energetic potential of space to be 10 to the 94th power grams per cubic centimeter. That's a theoretical calculation, but it comes out of a consideration that points to that space is not a vacuum, but a plenum. And I like the word plenum because the word plenum in the dictionary means an absolute fullness. And to continue to use the word vacuum for space that we now know to be anything but empty, space we now know to be characterized by virtually boundless luminosity. It's efflorescing with light, with what are sometimes called vacuum photons, virtual light. But I believe that this light is actually, the light that is informing all being. It's the lumen naturale that is what people of awakened consciousness actually perceive. I literally believe it's a light that is living all of existence. And it's really striking to see that these breakthroughs happening on the leading edge of physics, describing space as having the properties of boundless luminosity, infinite energetic potential, and I believe sentience. I find that all the great spiritual traditions of the world characterize consciousness or mind in its unconditioned nature as being equivalent to or analogous to space. I think that it actually is space. I think that the space that we are currently arising in is really identical to what is called the Great Spirit, the mind of God. It is this field of boundless potentiality that is currently, right in this moment, manifesting itself as this entire universe. And that we are actually arising out of this field every instant, every nanosecond. There is a new creation emerging out of the field. And a lot of the physics of zero-point energy is finding out that the key to interacting with this field and tapping it is resonance, as has been talked about a number of times before. Years ago, I did a number of experiments with piezoelectric ringing resonance, which was resonating piezoelectric crystals, and I found that at certain states of resonance, these crystals actually put out more power than you were putting in. It was a matter of tuning them just properly. And I find it really profound to see that at certain states of resonance, effects take place that seem to contravene or contradict our understanding of the laws of physics and our understanding of the laws of conservation of energy. And this, I believe, also has profound implications for understanding the nature of ourselves, because we ourselves, right in this moment, are pervaded by that field of boundless luminosity, infinite energetic potential. Literally, our entire biocrystalline manifestation is emerging out of this plenum as an integrated complex of asymmetries arising out of this field of boundless potential. This is the view that's actually being brought forth at the leading edge of physics, and it sounds alluringly similar to the accounts that mystics describe in terms of literally feeling everything in the embrace of the Great Spirit, feeling everything arising out of this field of infinite potential. And really, when we really look at it, every particle, every electron can actually be seen as a geometrico-dynamic modification of this dynamic plenum of infinite potentiality. Everything is literally breathing the Great Spirit, and the Great Spirit is breathing itself into existence as the whole universe. And when you realize that, when you contemplate it, you can recognize that this plenum is not something else. It's actually completely continuous with our being. We are absolutely seamless expressions of it. And so that field of infinite potential, we're not just talking about this infinite potential that exists in some kind of objective space independent of us. We're actually talking about our own true nature as being imbued with that infinite potential. And I sincerely believe that the key to being able to move through this evolutionary bottleneck that the human race is in which there are enormously powerful and misguided forces that are basically controlling how energy is generated and distributed on this planet. That is an outer reflection of a spiritual condition in the species. But I find it very, very true to notice that the universe is manifesting in the specific way that it is as a reflection of the collective state of our internal subjective world. That the fact that right now, in the midst of this planetary crisis, we're making all of these discoveries that actually show that the laws of physics, the maps of reality that we've been operating on for hundreds of years, are actually special case, limited accounts of the actual nature of reality, and that, in fact, the new physics of the quantum vacuum, the quantum plenum, reveals to us that in a very scientifically unassailable way, that scarcity, limitation, and lack, which has profoundly informed human psychology for millennia, is a lie. It cannot be sustained. This new science promises to not only provide us with guidance in building a completely clean energy infrastructure, resonant technologies that allow us to live in phase and in harmony with the universal energy field and with the Earth, but it also promises to give birth to a new science, a love-based science of abundance that is expressive of and bringing into greater focus and clarity that which all the great enlightened beings have been attempting to communicate to the human race for millennia, that we ourselves have a direct access. We are directly plugged into this field of infinite intelligence, boundless luminosity, infinite potential. In other words, we ourselves, the human biocrystalline unit, our bodies, we are actually piezoelectric crystals. We are biopiezoelectric crystals. And the fact that I was able to ring a piezoelectric crystal and get an over-unity effect at a certain mode of resonance is very indicative that there's got to be, in the human system, a state of coherent integration and operation in which we ourselves become over-unity humans, a state in which we actually can bring about this unlimited access to the field of intelligence and energy and consciousness. That is what the new science is pointing towards. And this is really what all the enlightened beings throughout the ages have been pointing to. They've been pointing that there's a more abundant way to live. That we are limiting, crippling, and reducing our potential by operating out of fear-based belief systems, axioms of limitation and lack. And so those belief systems are actually playing an enormous role in limiting our range of possibilities. That's one of the amazing things about discovering that we are arising in a field of pure infinite potential. The only limitations on what we can do are the ones that we believe in. Our limitations really are things that we have been conditioned into, and the whole culture is conditioning us into. And I feel that one of the profound things about the new physics that accompanies the new energy technology is a deeper understanding of light. We've been operating out of a truncated and limited model of electromagnetism. Maxwell's equations are really not Maxwell's equations. They're a truncated and limited vector form of done by Heaviside and Gibbs of Maxwell's original equations. In other words, there's whole degrees of oscillation, whole dimensions of resonance that are completely left out of the model of light that we've been operating out in the 20th century. I think that's very symbolic that the whole 20th century has been operating out of a limited and truncated view of light. As we are now starting to understand that there's more dimensions of resonance to light than we had thought, there's also more to light than meets the eye. that light is not just electromagnetic, that there are higher dimensions of light. In fact, the physics that actually explains the operation of many of these free energy devices requires us to go into higher gauge symmetries, which is basically higher dimensions of light. And these higher dimensions of light, as we come to see them, are describing higher degrees of freedom of light. Well, that's something that is described by the mystics as this discovery of the inner light. The inner light of spirit, the light of love, the light of consciousness, the light of understanding. Materialist science tends to dismiss that as just poetic metaphor, but what if there really is an actual higher dimensional field of light that the electromagnetic spectrum is just a lower dimensional parameterized standing wave pattern subset of, and that inner light may actually be something that we are made of, that it may be the very light of our consciousness, and that when we look within, we come to understand that which constitutes the field of our subjectivity is literally this higher dimensional light. The same light that these devices are engaging in certain states of tuned resonance. The fact that this new science of light is emerging at this time, I believe, can actually guide us into what I believe is the most critical area of focus for us who are interested in moving forward the new energy movement agenda, which is really, it can guide us in learning how to cooperate better. You know, humanity right now gets very low grades in terms of its ability to just cooperate. And that has a lot to do with the fact that we have been culturally conditioned and to operate out of the notion of a separate self, the notion that we are actually a separate, encapsulated, egoic entity. That's a pretty, easy way to view ourselves. It's kind of seductive to see it that way, but it just does not hold up to the tests of this new science. The fact is, we are actually all dynamic modifications of a seamless, all-pervading, contiguous field of light, energy, and consciousness, which is currently manifesting the world at this moment. And we can engage that field. We have the ability to engage the plenum. In fact, much of spiritual practice is about engaging the plenum, directly getting our body, mind, temple synchronized with this field of infinite potential, this field of loving, blissful consciousness, which is what the whole world is arising in, floating in, as it emerges moment by moment, miraculously out of this field. I think that the thing that we really need to focus on in terms of building this movement is really developing a new disposition relative to our planetary predicament, recognizing that the disposition of polarization has characterized this movement and many human movements for a long time. And the polarization manifests in this sense of like an us versus them dynamic. And I know so many inventors who are just so deeply embedded in that notion. And I can understand it, I can empathize with it, because there are these absolutely tyrannical, powerful forces manifested in the form of the powers that be, the petroleum industry, the governments, etc., that are actively fighting against and preventing the innovations that we are dreaming up, that we are wanting to bring and give to humanity as a gift. And yet, that very dynamic of polarization itself is part of the problem. I believe that in discovering that there are these devices that we're bringing forth, many of them participate in this higher degrees of freedom, in this sort of more open-ended space, this more creative dimension of light that we ourselves have direct access to. I believe that if we're developing a technology that is in its way of operation, several higher degrees of freedom, closer to, you might say, the Great Spirit, I believe it calls for us to develop ways of operating in which we have an ethical and moral impulse in which we operate in terms of higher degrees of ethics and higher degrees of consciousness relative to what we're actually up against. We need to cohere this movement. We need to develop a way of learning how to cultivate our collective dynamic in such a way that we can become an unassailable movement, a movement that can really move forward and be a movement. I mean, a movement is meant to create movement, and a lot of movement is required at this time. And there are enormously powerful, you could call them shadow forces in the world, which I really also means just unconscious forces. And these unconscious forces are not just out there in the people we may be seeking to bring along in our efforts, but they're in us. We all have unconscious parts of ourselves. And I believe that the greatest thing we can do for this movement and for the awakening of human consciousness is to really intensify our inner efforts at becoming conscious and owning and integrating and embracing all of our wounded and split off and disowned parts. Because those are the things that tend to create the most dissonance in terms of human collectives. I have seen so many different groups of people who get together around noble, high-minded ideals, and yet when you get the people together, all kinds of interpersonal stuff, human inertia, gets in the way of actually accomplishing even a fraction of manifesting those goals. So I think that the need to realize that the sociological, psycho-spiritual dimension of this whole movement is really where we can all be empowered to be active right now. We can actually learn to transcend the tendencies that we have in our peculiar psyches, with all of their things ways we've been wounded, all the ways our buttons get pushed, and we tend to judge people and all that. We can start to discover that in waking up from the dream of scarcity, in waking up from the lie of limitation and lack, we can also start to recognize that we are not separate selves. We are actually expressions of the plenum. We are expressions of the unified field. We are absolutely contiguous with each other. We literally are each other. And in that consciousness, we actually can snap out of the illusion of the separate self and recognize that our entire outer experience is an unmitigated, immediate reflection of our consciousness, of our mind. So it's very accurate to say that at the leading edge of physics, in our understanding of the nature of the unified field as a sentient field of light and consciousness, that literally physics is discovering the universe to be a dream-like phenomena, in the sense that what we're doing with our consciousness affects the way events unfold in the outer world. And that if you were to wake up in a dream, you recognize that all the dream characters in the dream are not separate beings. In an ordinary night dream, you're just under the spell of the dream. You think everybody is separate beings. You think you are who you think you are, the dream ego. But you actually, after you wake up, you realize, oh, well, that was all just in my mind. That was just a manifestation of my psyche. But usually that's after the fact. If you can wake up in the dream and recognize that all these apparently other people are actually expressions of the same self that we are currently expressions of, that we're all emanations of this profound field of infinite potential. And all the incredible diversity and variations that we all have is part of the exquisite nature of existence. And to recognize that if you're triggered or polarized by another person, that's a direct flashing neon sign that you have something to look at in yourself. And that there's a tremendous need to develop a disposition of self-referral and constantly realizing that anything that is problematic in the outer world has a component inside ourselves, and that we can work on the inner issues that are actually giving rise to those outer circumstances. I think that if this movement is going to be successful, we have to have the sophistication, the spiritual awareness and sophistication to recognize what we're actually up against in terms of the enormously unconscious forces that are currently in the process of committing terroricide, in the process of killing the biosphere, unconsciously, or perhaps some of them doing it consciously. But in order to face these enormously challenging and dark forces, we really have to be very, very awake in terms of our understanding of the role of how our consciousness engages in the process. In other words, to be really, really awake to the fact that in any moment, we ourselves can fall asleep and act out unconscious tendencies, and that we need to find a way to put limits on that whole thing, because inside our movement, we can't afford to have psychological inertia. We need to learn how to come into phase in a really profound way such that we become an unassailable movement that expresses this higher integrity of being that is what we're wanting to see in the rest of the world. You know, right now we don't really have an energy crisis on the planet. We have a crisis or an energy shortage. We have an integrity shortage. Yeah. And the need for all of us to work on our own personal integrity. We could all have more integrity. It's something that's basically the spiritual path, is getting the hypocrisies out of our system and becoming more and more consistent and integrated and aligned. The more we do that, the more we get the bioimpedance out of our biocrystalline matrix, the more we transduce the all-pervading universal energy, and the more we move towards becoming over-unity humans. The more we'll have a direct, experiential, tangible feeling of moving in a world of boundless abundance. And that's, I believe that what we have to do in order to really help create the changes in the world, and with the challenges we have in terms of changing the technological infrastructure, we really need to be the change we want to see in the world in terms of how we treat each other and how we operate. We need to completely leave the competitive dynamic behind. That is the dynamic that allows us to be divided and conquered continuously. It's a very profound thing to recognize that by simply discovering coherence in yourself, then effortlessly it radiates out and actually engenders the same in everyone around us. That we, in fact, are also these very refined resonators, and that this effect of resonance that we have discovered as key to many of these over-unity devices and new electromagnetic systems, also, we are those systems, and so the way our disposition, our state of mind, our emotional state radiates out and affects everyone else. And resonance has this quality of entrainment. So whatever state of mind you're in, you tend to impact and entrain others into the similar state of mind. So there's really a call towards a higher state of self-observation and consciousness in terms of how we tune our own resonators in relationship to each other. And I believe that the dynamic that we're facing in terms of how do we bring these technologies forth into the marketplace, I think there's a multi-tiered approach that we should take. I have observed over a number of decades the nature of the suppression of these technologies, and that happened to me. I actually had my laboratory destroyed a couple times in the process of developing these technologies, and I wasn't coming from a paranoid place, but that actually happened. And I found that to be an amazing effect, almost more interesting than the over-unity effect, that you develop a device and then people show up and destroy your lab. Like, to me, that was a very powerful piece of data about the nature of the power structure on the planet. And I believe that we need to recognize that over time, the dynamics and the strategies of suppression have become more sophisticated. I hear many less stories of people who are actually threatened or having their labs destroyed these days. The way they generally affect us is through just, if we become on the radar, they just make sure we don't get funded, or they send certain agents of chaos into our field that prevents us from getting our business together to try to bring these things forth. And it really seems like right now, the powers that be have their hands full with all kinds of other power struggles on the planet, and that they're not so much concerned with if a couple inventors develop free energy devices. I know quite a few people who have operating devices, and they haven't had any problems. But the process of actually bringing them to market and mass producing them, that's the place at which these efforts get shut down. And they tend to get shut down in a variety of ways. But I think that given that we're trying to break through this challenge and get actual clean energy technologies that represent this quantum leap forward, that are really resonant field technologies that are just have no, really are not utilizing any fuel and are just tapping energy from the field in some way, shape, or form. That kind of technology, I think, is so profound in terms of its advent on the planet that to try to just push it out according to the old business models may be part of the problem, because these technologies are based on a completely different physics. You put one of these on the table and you demonstrate it to people, and it provides an unassailable counterexample to the entire justification for a world in which the social, political, and economic structure is based in fear and scarcity, and that the threat at psychological levels, the challenge to change our paradigm, is just implicit in these technologies themselves. I believe the resistance is not just that it threatens financial interests. It threatens to pull the rug out from under the entire dominant world view. And that dominant worldview is one that actually needs to dissolve at this time if we're to survive. That worldview is a worldview that cannot allow humanity to go forward and develop a sustainable culture in harmony with the earth. So what the free energy technologies are pointing to is a very, very profound transformation of the very nature of being human. The fact that these technologies are emerging at this time, I see as a reflection of an awakening of consciousness that's going on throughout the species. And the need to recognize that since they're involving a whole new physics, a whole sort of, in a sense, a more spiritual physics, we actually need to rethink our whole strategies about bringing these technologies forward. Many of the old sort of capitalistic business models have real problems in terms of that, because there's this element of needing to make money that's kind of right there in the middle of the whole equation, that in fact the whole monetary aspect of our reality right now needs to be really considered and looked at with greater depth. It's something that hasn't been mentioned a whole lot here, but our current economic system, our planetary economic system, is actually has no basis in any real value. The Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve notes are basically fiat money. They're just generated by the declaration, let there be money. And they're designed in such a way, they're designed to keep us hamstrung in debt. They're actually evidence of debt. When you have dollar bills, those are actually IOUs, meaning you owe that to the Federal Reserve. The fact that we have a profoundly, screechingly unjust monetary system within which we're attempting to move forward with these technologies. This economic system that we're in is highly manipulated and controlled. And it's one of the most profound ways that the movements forward in new energy and all kinds of other areas, social, political, economic, the whole general planetary emergence of a new paradigm-based culture is being straitjacketed economically by an economic system that is based on no real value. In fact, it's basically based on the theft of trillions and trillions of dollars that are being generated by the human family. If you just, basically what is going on, and this is hard for a lot of people to wrap their minds around, the fact that the way the government is currently operating actually makes Enron look like a paragon of integrity. If you're aware of the work of Catherine Austin Fitts and Solari, the need to actually, in addition to redesigning the energy infrastructure, we need to take on the challenge that is before all humanity to redesign the architecture of the economy so that we have a just economy that actually reflects the values of an emerging planetary culture. There's just to give you a glimpse of the level of theft that is going on, in our government. Just look at whereisthemoney.org. That just gives you a little glimpse of it. But the fact is that there is no accountability in the current economic system. It's been designed that way. In fact, the way accounting is taught to all the CPAs is a way that obfuscates and prevents accountability. The only way that originally accounting was to make people accountable. And we don't have such a form of accounting. So there's a need to really basically redesign the monetary system. And that's something we can actually do in our local communities. We are the ones who give value to Federal Reserve notes. We all are having to use them to varying degrees. But I think that what we are being challenged to do, that the new energy movement is a sign of, we're being challenged to redesign a completely new kind of planetary culture, a completely new social, political, economic, and psycho-spiritual system that these clean energy technologies really enable us in fact, they're a symbol of that new kind of covenant with the earth, a new kind of pact of our choice to be truly walking lightly on the earth and living in a humble, sustainable way in relationship to the biosphere. The call that is really emerging, and I'm seeing this emerging all over the planet, is to develop a new kind of culture, a new visionary culture that is a culture of peace and harmony with the biosphere. This new culture has a number of natural ethics that are part of it, and they're based on a higher state of consciousness, a more expanded, more feeling-based, feeling-connected base with the whole interconnected web of life. This is something the indigenous cultures have a lot to teach us, that we in the Western cultures are walking around with a lot of trauma in our systems. We are in a state of sort of emotional dissociation from our interconnectedness. That's how we can go about continuing to just pollute and pour toxic waste into the oceans and the rivers and somehow think that that's somehow separate from us. That kind of emotional dissociation at the root of our body minds is something that needs to be overcome. We need to bring our bodies back to life and regenerate our feeling functions, because one of the things that will drive this movement to success is a whole bodily connected emotional passion coming out of our love for the earth. And if that is crippled, and if we're walking around in sort of in trauma, it's very hard to mobilize the coherent focus and intention that can drive us forward to overcome the challenges that lie before this movement. And so what I would suggest is to think not only of constantly having to like penetrate the mainstream with these new energy technologies, but recognize that there is also, in parallel to that effort, which is very important, there is also the development of a completely new kind of planetary culture that is already just embodying these principles. And they're not interested in making the dominant culture change. They're just going ahead and creating living demonstrations of this new way of being, living in new communities that are in harmony with the earth. And in many of these communities, the most conspicuous place where there's still a lack of integrity is that they still need to generate their energy in a way that is often tied into the power grid or to fossil fuels. And so these clean energy technologies that this movement is supporting and engendering and helping nursemaid into being are really the critical element in allowing a much higher integrity embodiment of new culture to take place all over the planet. And the recognition that right now, given that we're dealing with this very difficult economic challenge of just getting funded, I mean, it should be kind of mind-blowing that the amount of money that's flying around the planet every day, you know, and the amount of money that's being spent on war and all kinds of things that are actively destructive to life and the planet, that we as a movement, what we require is such a pittance, such a tiny little bit of that money, and that we have, in our collective intelligence, have not been able to bring it into this movement yet, is a huge sign of the economic lockdown, economic dictatorship that we're living under. The fact that we do not have an economic democracy, which is what Thomas Jefferson was constantly a champion of, and said that we have to have an economy in which the form of the economy is chosen by the people. We do not have that. We have an economic dictatorship, and it is oppressing so many people and preventing the development of all kinds of innovations that are just yearning to come forth. So there's a movement all over the world that's developing alternative currencies in which they're just dropping out of, in mind, the Federal Reserve's note system or the fractional reserve banking system, and just developing local currencies that enable people to have sort of bioregional, barter-based ways of exchanging value in which you don't have this, the problems that the current economic system has, like charging interest. Charging interest really screws up the whole original meaning of money, because money is just representing goods and services to be exchanged, and then suddenly people got the idea that just for lending money to somebody, you should actually make money off of money, and that actually starts distorting and is tremendously distorted the whole economic system, such that there's whole groups of people who are just making enormous amounts of money without lifting a finger, providing no goods and services. And then the vast majority of the planet is required to toil and struggle in hard labor to barely survive. The need to redress that imbalance is something that these clean energy technologies can play a central role in, because these clean energy technologies are a new form of delivering power to the people. It really is, by its very nature, a power to the people movement. As people start having access to their own systems where they can just freely tap into the universal ambient energies and use it for electrical power and not have to pay for it, other than the cost of the device, this really heralds a completely new form of distributed power. And it's not just distributed electrical power, but it also reflects a new form of power sharing among the human race. And the deep connections between electrical power and power, the resonances between that, and the need to change the power structure that this movement brings about. So it has profound spiritual roots, and it connects with many other like peace and social justice movements around the planet. And I think we can align with those movements, and we need to really make a clear and incisive case that the new energy movement is completely and coherently integral to a whole range of other movements that are in the process of attempting to bring forth their agendas, which are really part of building a new world that's more peaceful and embodies a kind of integral social justice in harmony with the biosphere. So my thought is that in addition to working to bring these technologies out in a way that gets them into the mainstream marketplace, which we need to do, there's no doubt about that, but we also can recognize that in calling these technologies free energy technologies, perhaps we should also, at this stage in our process, be in complete integrity with the fact they're free energy technologies and forget about making money on them and just build them and give them to people. So that way, rather than feeling like we can't do anything until we can actually make a business and make money and enter the marketplace, we can start a diffusion strategy whereby these technologies can just be starting to be used by people all over the world, which will actually start generating a field of support for this kind of, clean, harmonious, what I like to call resonant field technologies. They're technologies that are just engaging in the resonant field that has this property of syntropy. One of the profound things about these technologies is that they point to a deeper level of nature that's characterized by syntropy, or like which is the opposite of entropy. The second law of thermodynamics, as we have talked about before, is really a instantiation of a state of consciousness characterized by entropy. And to be able to recognize and demonstrate unassailably that there's this deeper level of nature, if we can learn to be in harmony with it, we can actually start developing a synthropic human culture, a culture that is functioning in a way that the more we come into coherence with the field of the planet, the universal field of energy, the more energy we'll have access to. It's really different than the whole scarcity-based notion of, there's only so much energy and, if you use it up, it's gone. In this notion, this new paradigm, we discover that the more we just allow energy to flow, the more we share, in other words, the more we are in a mode of selfless service and giving, the more that energy just becomes available to us. There's just no limitation of it. We're living in a boundless field of abundant light and energy, and we can start living that in any moment. It's simply a matter of recognizing that and waking up from the dream of scarcity, realizing that we've been participating in a planetary nightmare by the paradigm that we've been operating out of. And there's enormous amount of material coming out these days supporting people into moving into higher states of harmony and coherence with each other in a way that I believe can really be the salvation of the human race. It can really bring about a profound transformation, because one of the things that's occurring in the process of bringing this forth, in the process of developing a new planetary culture that's based on a truly cosmic awareness. Some are calling this galactic culture that is not at all putting its allegiance in nationalism, in any particular national government, or in any corporations, any human-made institutions, but our primary allegiance in this culture is to the biosphere itself and to the universe. And this sense of allegiance to the interconnected web, the seamless interconnected web of life, and that's primarily what we're pledging our allegiance to, I believe holds the promise of bringing forth a movement that can really sweep the planet. I was just recently in Europe, and I see signs of this culture emerging everywhere. We shouldn't be too depressed by the fact that what's going on in this country, what's going on in this country is an enormous challenge to all of us, a challenge to wake up and become active agents in being co-creative together and really standing for a different form of existence than the one that is being imposed upon us and the one that is acting itself out in our national government right now. We have the power to engage the field of infinite abundance in any moment, and in that spirit, I believe we'll be able to bring forth a clean energy infrastructure. And we need to engage all different levels, and the process of the sociological, psychological side of the equation, I believe, is the place where most of us can make our greatest contribution, because it's really not so much about everybody learning the new physics or becoming an engineer. There's a lot of people bringing these technologies forth. The engineering is really a snap compared to the human engineering challenges that we have in terms of really learning to operate coherently out of unconditional love relative to each other. We now have a new science that can articulate the doctrine of unconditional love in a very, very coherent way. And I believe the emergence of a new scientifically articulated universal spirituality is something that can really enable us to meet the challenges ahead and recognize that there really is no they out there, that we're all awakening together. We're undergoing a spiritual awakening on this planet, and that the embodiment of new energy technology is a physical sign and manifestation of us moving into an entirely new phase of our evolution, and that the old systems are crumbling and dying, and that they kick up quite a fight in that process. But their days are numbered, and we can take great solace in that and just become agents of the change we want to see. So, thank you. Thanks a lot.
You're going to be about questions of the panel.
Yeah, okay. Is that tonight? Okay, thanks. Thank you.
See what I mean? Mark Cummings. Oh, that's great. Now you know why you have to know Mark Cummings. We're going to take a break. It's well earned by all of you. I know the seating hasn't been as comfortable as yesterday's, but we're going to reconvene at 3:15. Please be prompt, and thank you very much.